Hi again then guys, and so we've got another Special Projects custom build for you today, and this is one which, to be honest, I hadn't actually planned to release that soon. It was a build that I made quite a while ago, but I just hadn't planned to have it that close. I tend to go more for real replicas rather than custom builds. But of course, I released the fictional build for a BMW M4 CSL on Tuesday, and that actually proved to be quite popular. The feedback that I got from that was good. So, for those who are fans of the M4 and would like to see more like that in the vein of the CSL, I also built this one. This is a much more far-fetched build. It's still not insane. I've tried to keep it realistic as to what it could actually be like, but this is my interpretation of what a BMW M4 GTR could be like, because of course we have the M3 of the E46 shape GTR, or the Strassenversion, the street version as it's called, which is a homologation car, a road-going version of the race car. This, though, is basically my interpretation of that on the M4. But the M3 street version didn't really take the concept of that car as far as it could go. It didn't have a huge amount of power, it wasn't particularly lightweight. So I've made this as to what an M4 GTR should be like, rather than what it just could be like. So I haven't gone extreme, I haven't gone over the top, it hasn't got 1,000 horsepower or anything like that, but I've made it so that it would actually be a legitimate GTR, not just something that's rare and expensive for the sake of it, which is essentially what the GTR was before. So, we'll go over first of all to the tuning garage for the visuals, then to the mechanical tuning garage for the setup, and finally take it out to a racetrack to see how it feels, how it performs, and how it compares to the CSL. Now, for the visuals, the GTR of course has a body kit which is reminiscent of the racing version, and it has a little bit of extra wingage on the back, that little spoiler on the boot. I would have liked to have given this car a smaller rear wing to be more of an homage to that vehicle, but that's just not available, so I went for more of a GTS style wing. Now, I've opted for the Type B body kit, which completely changes the front bumper, gives you bigger side skirts, and a completely different back end with a much larger diffuser. Now, the back end, I would say, looks a little bit too chunky. It makes the car have kind of a wedge profile, which I don't really like, to be honest, but it gives you the overall look that at least distinguishes it from the normal M4 and makes it look more like a homologation car. Now, there is no flat floor. For the rear wing, of course, I've gone for the custom wing. Just before we go to the wing, I've also fitted the carbon effect grille for the same reasons as the CSL. And for the wing, I've gone for the Type E wing support, which is a relatively minimal wing. I've gone for the Type H wing itself on top, which is a slightly curved wing, curved with the shape of the boot, and also the Type J winglets, which is relatively small, quite minimal again. I've got the lowest possible height, which is still quite high, unfortunately, and for a width I've gone +5, because I didn't want the wing to be ridiculously big, like a full-on race car, but as I said, kind of like a GTS style wing. Again, I've left the rims the stock BMW M4 wheels because they look appropriate, to me anyway. If you want to change them though, of course you could. As far as the paint colours, I opted for silver, because of course the existing street version of the GTR is silver. So the silver that I've gone for is one of my favourite silvers to use actually. It's called liquid silver, and you can get that from kind of the Jaguar XFR, but there are actually a couple of different ones, because the Jaguar is called liquid silver metallic, whereas this is just called liquid silver. It's essentially the same colour, but I'm not sure why the name changed. Of course you could go for a completely different silver if you so chose. I've gone for that same colour on the wing. It does look like a slightly different tone though, which is unfortunate. And for the brakes, I've gone for red. Obviously, again, you could go for whatever colour you want, but I've gone for Colton Red, which comes from one of the older Mitsubishi Evos, which is quite a strong, bright red for that kind of performance look to the brakes. But that's it overall for the visual look of the car. A little bit more extreme than the CSL, because that seemed to be appropriate to me anyway, to a GTR style vehicle. So now let's go over to the mechanical tuning garage for the setup. Now again, like the CSL build, this is a PP relevant tune, significantly higher PP, 550. Again, I've gone for sports softs because it is after all the street version of the GTR. I have upgraded the brakes to racing brakes on this one. For the suspension, I've got the ride height on 110 on the front, 130 on the rear, and that is partially to counteract the aforementioned wedge shape that body kit gives you. For the springs, I've increased them to 675 and 875. The dampers to 4, anti-roll I've left on 3, neutral camber and toe. We'll come back to the gearbox last. Again, like with the brakes, I have opted to upgrade the clutch, flywheel and prop shaft on this one. For the diff, we've got the lowest initial torque, highest acceleration and braking, and I must say the handling on the M4 is very good no matter how you tune it. As far as power, I've gone for more, obviously, 460 horsepower on my CSL tune. I opted to round it off to 500 because I didn't want to make it too high, but 500 seemed like the kind of power which you might expect from a more modern interpretation of the GTR. So, in order to get it to be rounded off as far as specs, I've given it the Stage 3 engine tune, sports computer, semi-race exhaust, intake tuning and an oil change, and then reduced it down to 79.3% power. And as far as the downforce on that optional wing, got that as high as possible. And for the weight reduction, we've got Stage 2 and window weight reduction with an 8 kilo ballast to bring us up to 1300 kilos, and I've put that towards the back of the car just to slightly improve the weight distribution. Finally, for the gearbox, I've opted for a slightly closer ratio overall than the normal one. Not necessarily for the individual gears, but more so in terms of final drive. So we've gone for an auto setting of 205, then for the individual gears 4.7, 3.2, 2375, 1850, 1.5, 1250 and 1075 with a final drive of 2.7. Now you can of course change around those gears if you need more top speed or slightly closer gearing for whatever track, but that's just the gears that I've gone for a theoretical gearbox in effect. So that's it overall for the mechanical setup. Now let's take it out to the track to see how it feels. Now when I built this car, I wanted it to feel as different from my CSL as possible. I wanted it to be a completely different machine, a completely different animal, not just the same thing with a bit more power. And thankfully, I was able to achieve that. It feels completely different. I wanted the car to be harsher, harder, more taut, more focused, and less forgiving. I wanted it to be a car which requires effort to drive, and it is. It's stiffer, harsher through the corners. You have to stamp on the throttle, stamp on the brakes, wrestle with the steering. You can get the tail out quite easily, but it's not necessarily a drift machine, and it definitely feels completely different than the CSL, which is actually quite an easy car to drive. The handling is very soft, very forgiving, and although this car is definitely quicker, I would say it's not as beginner friendly, and very deliberately so. So if you do decide to use this build and you find the handling to be a little bit too heavy or a little too harsh, I would recommend messing around with both the acceleration and deceleration settings in the diff. That will make the car much more supple to drive. But as it is, I'm happy with the car. I like that it's more difficult to get the best out of and more harsh and less forgiving. It seems appropriate to a homologation car that it would feel like that, a more hardcore, aggressive vehicle. So if you do decide to use this fictional build for what a GTR Strassenversion could be like, then obviously I hope you find it fun, potentially even competitive in racing. But that's it overall for this custom special project. So I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.